Stellantis is investing some big money in plants across the country, including one close by up in Dundee.
This wasn't just another release. It felt like an exorcism of everything Dodge once stood for. The all-electric Dodge Charger Daytona arrived with press releases promising the next era of American performance. But to those who believe performance begins with a naturally aspirated roar, it was more like a funeral. Dodge tried replicating the V8's thunder with its Fratzonic Chambered Exhaust, but it sounded more like a ghost with a broken microphone. Then came the $63,480 sticker. Enough to keep die-hard fans at bay. Dealerships were paralyzed. In desperation, Stellantis shoved these electric outcasts onto employees at absurd lease rates to move them off dusty lots. A futuristic promise devolved into a hollow apology, fracturing the sacred bond Dodge loyalists once held dear. And that was only the beginning. Ready to see how far this storm goes? Are you ready to uncover the secrets, the scandals, and the seismic shifts? Stay with us, because this changes everything. Jeep's $70,000 price tag and the death of accessibility. Jeep built its name on grit, not glamour. It stood for freedom, simplicity, and off-road capability that didn't break the bank. But in the span of just a few years, Jeep's transformation into a high-priced lifestyle brand left its original fan base behind, and nowhere was that more obvious than with the latest Wrangler Rubicon. This is a vehicle that, in 2019, could be bought fully loaded for around $57,000. Today, that same Rubicon, still with cloth seats, still lacking the steel bumper option, is priced at $70,740. That's not a premium, that's price insanity. What changed? Almost nothing. A few new paint colors, a redesigned dash, slight tweaks to the axles. Stellantis marketed these as major upgrades, but longtime Jeep owners weren't fooled. The new features added virtually no real-world value, just corporate markup. For the blue-collar families and adventurers who once turned to Jeep as an affordable, capable off-road companion, the brand had priced itself out of reach. Meanwhile, used Wranglers with better trims and real modifications could be had for tens of thousands less. Take the example of a 2019 Rubicon. Fully loaded, customized with lifts, steel bumpers, 37-inch tires, and winches. All in, $53,000. That's nearly $20,000 less than a stock new model, and it performs better. So what exactly are buyers paying for today? A badge? A paint code? A glossy brochure full of half-truths? Jeep isn't just inflating prices. They're abandoning the very people who made the Wrangler iconic. It used to be a vehicle that stood proudly at the intersection of utility and freedom. Now it's trapped in the cul-de-sac of suburban luxury, wearing a price tag that spits in the face of its heritage. And just when customers thought they'd seen enough, Ram stepped in with something worse. But before I reveal what it is, quick, hit the subscribe button. Thanks, that was easy, right? Ram abandons the Hemi and loses its soul. When Stellantis killed the Hemi, they didn't just lose an engine, they lost a generation. The Hemi V8 wasn't just an engine, it was an identity. It powered legends, from the Ram TRX to the Challenger Hellcat. It stood for raw torque, thunderous acceleration, and mechanical authenticity in a world increasingly chasing software and silence. But in one quiet move, Stellantis pulled the plug on it all. In its place, a twin-turbocharged inline six-cylinder called the Hurricane. On paper, it was efficient and powerful, but emotionally, it was sterile. The Hemi's bellow became a whisper. The mechanical simplicity of displacement was replaced with the complexity of forced induction. And for the people who actually drive trucks, who feel every rev in their chest, who grew up wrenching on old-school American muscle, this wasn't progress. It was betrayal. Customers noticed instantly. Reviews praised the specs but missed the soul. Truck fans didn't care that the Hurricane had marginally better fuel efficiency or slightly more torque. They cared that it sounded like a kitchen appliance. And the aftermarket, it froze. Nobody wanted to mod or show off a twin-turbo inline six. The excitement died with the camshaft. This wasn't about emissions. This was about emotion. Stellantis tried to rationalize the change as a response to government pressure and efficiency targets. But at the end of the day, Dodge and Ram didn't need to be rational. They needed to be passionate. The V8 wasn't just a powertrain, it was a promise. And breaking that promise came with consequences. Loyal buyers turned to Ford and Chevrolet, still offering proper V8s. Forums lit up with outrage. Social media turned hostile. Stellantis didn't just drop a cylinder, they dropped their customer base. Even then, Stellantis wasn't finished making enemies. Not by a long shot. The $80,000 truck nobody wants. Ram's EV gamble collapses. This truck was supposed to change everything. Instead, it's sitting unsold on lots. The Ram 1500 REV was announced as the next great leap forward in electric trucks. It promised futuristic styling, big range, and innovation worthy of America's hardest-working brand. But reality hit harder than expected, and it hit before the truck even made it to market. Originally set to debut in 2025, the Ram EV was quietly delayed to 2026. The reason? Lack of demand. Dealers were already nervous. Stellantis pivoted to an extended-range version that relies on a gasoline generator to support battery life, a hybrid in disguise. Why? Because they knew full electric wasn't going to sell, and they were right. Interest in EV trucks across the board has stalled. Customers are hesitant. Charging infrastructure is inconsistent. Towing capability drops with battery drain. For working-class buyers who depend on their trucks, these issues aren't just inconvenient, they're deal breakers. Meanwhile, Ram EV prototypes carried price tags north of $85,000. That's nearly double the cost of a used V8-powered Ram that could outperform it in nearly every way that matters. And the Rev? It doesn't just lack the Hemi, it lacks a reason to exist. It's a truck designed to impress regulators, not buyers. The response was swift. Dealer lots stayed full, lease incentives ballooned. The forums that once praised the TRX became wastelands of sarcasm and regret. Ram hadn't led the charge, they'd marched straight into a trap. And while the public fallout raged, something far more dangerous was quietly unfolding behind the scenes. A corporate coup in the making. The chief executive officer ouster that no one saw coming. Stellantis didn't just change direction, they decapitated their leadership. For months, the writing was on the wall, but no one inside the industry dared to believe it. Carlos Tavares, the hard-nosed chief executive officer who led Stellantis into an aggressive electric vehicle future, was supposed to be untouchable. He had been the architect of the merger, the global strategist tasked with transforming the company into a lean, electrified powerhouse. But behind the curtain, the cracks were widening. Sales were collapsing, customers were furious. And Stellantis' most iconic brands, Ram, Dodge, and Jeep, were bleeding market share. The breaking point came when Stellantis' latest electric offerings, the Charger Daytona, the Ram 1500 REV, flopped harder than anyone had predicted. Dealerships were stuck with unsellable inventory, shareholders were restless, and consumer backlash reached a boiling point. Inside the boardroom, the blame had to land somewhere, and it landed squarely on Tavares' desk. The board didn't stop at a quiet resignation. They staged a corporate coup. Tavares was removed, and in a stunning reversal, they brought back a familiar name, Tim Kuniskis, the man many in the industry called the father of the Hemi V8. It was a move no one saw coming. Kuniskis wasn't just another executive. He was a symbol of everything Stellantis had walked away from. He represented muscle, authenticity, and raw, unapologetic American horsepower. Bringing him back wasn't just a leadership change, it was an admission that Stellantis had lost its way. The shockwaves reverberated across the industry. Analysts were stunned. Shareholders were confused. Inside Stellantis Detroit offices, some employees celebrated, others panicked. But bringing back a leader is one thing. What they did next shocked the entire market. The secret plan to resurrect the V8. They told you the V8 was dead. Stellantis quietly disagreed. While the headlines focused on electric vehicle launches and climate pledges, Stellantis' new leadership team was working behind closed doors on something no one in the media expected: the resurrection of the Hemi V8 engine. It started with a simple question in the boardroom: what if we never should have killed it? Kuniskis knew the answer. He immediately ordered a feasibility study to assess whether Stellantis could bring back the Hemi without violating new emission standards or destroying their profit margins. The findings were clear. The manufacturing tools and engine lines hadn't been fully dismantled. The workforce who knew how to build the Hemi still existed. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. And politically, the timing couldn't have been better. The new administration in Washington had begun dismantling many of the 2030 and 2035 electric vehicle mandates. Pressure from environmental regulators was easing. The door had quietly reopened for internal combustion. Stellantis wasn't interested in making a big announcement, at least not yet. The plan was to restore V8 production gradually, first in limited edition Dodge models, then reintroduce it in Ram trucks. The company's engineers began drafting updated versions of the Hemi with modern emissions technology, striking a balance between raw power and regulatory compliance. This was not a nostalgic stunt. Stellantis believed this strategy could save their brand. The Hemi V8 wasn't just an engine, it was the heart of an entire market segment. Its death had driven buyers to Ford and General Motors. Its return could bring them back. Still, this wasn't just about engines. Ford and Chevrolet were watching, and they weren't happy. Ford and Chevrolet's boardrooms, panic behind closed doors. Stellantis bombshell left their rivals scrambling. When news of Stellantis' secret V8 resurrection plan leaked to Wall Street insiders, the immediate reaction wasn't public outrage, it was panic in the boardrooms of Ford and General Motors. For years, both companies had committed billions of dollars to an electric future. They slashed their internal combustion production lines, bet their balance sheets on battery factories, and sold the dream of full electrification to investors and policymakers. Ford had pushed its Lightning electric pickup as the new American truck. General Motors promised an entire fleet of battery-powered vehicles by 2035. Now Stellantis was quietly turning the clock backward, and the market was cheering. Internal emails flew back and forth between executives. Emergency meetings were held. Ford's leadership questioned whether their pivot to electric vehicles had been too aggressive. General Motors' board debated whether they needed to reconsider their zero-emissions timeline. Wall Street was watching, and investors were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. If Stellantis was bringing back the V8, why weren't they? For Ford and General Motors, this wasn't just a competitor's strategy shift. It was a threat to their entire corporate identity. Stellantis was gambling on what the other two Detroit giants had abandoned: American muscle, raw performance, and mechanical authenticity. The fear wasn't just losing sales, it was losing the narrative. All the while, as the chief executive officers fought for market share, another battle was quietly brewing in Washington. Why Stellantis' comeback terrified Wall Street? This wasn't just a product decision, it was a rebellion against the future. As Stellantis quietly prepared to bring back the Hemi V8, the reaction from Wall Street wasn't celebration, it was terror. For the past 5 years, investors had been sold a singular vision: that electrification was inevitable, that internal combustion was dead, and that automakers who failed to comply would collapse. Stellantis shattered that narrative. Their decision to revive V8 production sent a dangerous signal: that the electric vehicle transition wasn't a foregone conclusion, that consumer demand still ruled the market, and that regulators could be rolled back. Investors who had poured hundreds of billions of dollars into battery supply chains, electric vehicle startups, and charging infrastructure suddenly faced the possibility that they had bet on the wrong future. The financial press scrambled to make sense of it. Analysts warned that Stellantis' move could trigger a broader shift in the automotive market away from full electrification. Stock prices of battery manufacturers dipped. Hedge funds quietly reallocated positions. For Stellantis, the risk was enormous. Reversing course on electric vehicles could alienate progressive investors, invite regulatory backlash, and destabilize partnerships in Europe and Asia. But the potential reward was just as big if they could reclaim their working-class, performance-driven audience and humiliate their competitors in the process. Wall Street wasn't ready for that kind of rebellion. And the real fight wasn't happening in the boardroom, it was happening in the factories. The Environmental Protection Agency's green iron fist, and the industry backlash. This wasn't regulation, it was warfare against combustion. When the Biden administration's Environmental Protection Agency finalized its sweeping zero-emission mandates, they didn't just nudge the automotive industry toward a cleaner future, they throttled it into submission. Automakers were given strict timelines, massive penalties, and nearly impossible targets for fleet-wide emissions reductions. What was once a long-term transition toward electrification was suddenly a non-negotiable ultimatum: comply or die. For Stellantis, it wasn't just difficult, it was existential. The company had built its brand on combustion. From Dodge's supercharged Hellcats to Ram's bellowing Hemi trucks, Stellantis didn't just sell cars, they sold horsepower. Now, the Environmental Protection Agency was demanding the elimination of what made them iconic, and it wasn't just theoretical. By 2030, More than two-thirds of new vehicle sales were expected to be fully electric or zero-emission hybrids. Every combustion engine sold beyond that came with hefty fines, public shaming, and political consequences. The strain was immediate. Internal compliance teams scrambled to convert product pipelines. Engineers were pulled from combustion development and reassigned to battery platforms. Entire plants were mothballed or repurposed. Stellantis' legendary American muscle brands, Dodge and Ram, saw their future gutted. The Hemi engine, a crown jewel of the company's identity, was scheduled for termination, and they weren't alone. Ford, General Motors, Toyota all found themselves cornered by the Environmental Protection Agency's green iron fist. Compliance costs skyrocketed, margins evaporated, innovation stalled under regulatory panic. Executives began warning in quiet tones and off-the-record interviews that the American auto industry wasn't evolving. It was being dismantled. Outside of Washington, public reaction was mixed. Environmental advocates celebrated. Wall Street, eager for clean tech dividends, applauded. But in Detroit, Toledo, and small towns across the Midwest, workers weren't cheering. They were asking questions. What happens to our jobs? What happens to our communities? And why are politicians making decisions that threaten an entire way of life? It was a sensible question, just like me asking you. If you have subscribed yet, just do it. It only takes a second. Thanks. Now, after all of this, White House started to tighten the screws hard, but Trump was already plotting revenge. The deregulation shockwave, and Stellantis' secret weapon. One executive order changed everything. When Donald Trump returned to office, he wasted no time dismantling the electric vehicle agenda of his predecessor. In one swift signature, federal emissions mandates were frozen. Electric vehicle targets were pushed back. Environmental Protection Agency enforcement was curtailed. And just like that, the green tide turned. To the outside world, it looked like chaos. But for Stellantis, it was the opening they had been waiting for. With Environmental Protection Agency pressure easing, the company could shift its strategy without facing immediate regulatory penalties. Internally, executives referred to it as their second chance, a chance to win back their core audience, a chance to bring the combustion engine roaring back to life. Trump's deregulation wasn't just about environmental policy. It was personal. He saw the zero-emission mandates as a betrayal of American industry. He viewed electric vehicles as a concession to China, where most battery materials were sourced. And above all, he believed that the working-class voters who helped fuel his political rise were being ignored by elitist green policymakers. Stellantis read the room perfectly. They reactivated dormant tooling for the Hemi V8. They quietly reached out to suppliers about ramping up piston and camshaft production. They began reassigning engineers back to combustion development and paused several underperforming electric vehicle programs. Trump's policy reversal didn't just allow them to move, it gave them cover. Ford and General Motors, still tethered to their electrification narratives, hesitated. Stellantis, backed by the political winds of deregulation, surged forward. Their messaging became bolder. Muscle cars were back. Torque mattered again. The engine wasn't dead. It had been reborn. But while politicians played games, workers were preparing for war. The auto worker revolt. Why Stellantis faced a factory uprising. Workers weren't striking over wages. They were striking for engines. For decades, American auto workers had built engines with their hands, their sweat, and their pride. The Hemi V8 wasn't just a powertrain. It was a cultural artifact, forged on factory floors by generations of machinists, assemblers, and line workers. When Stellantis began shutting down Hemi production in favor of electric drivetrains, it wasn't framed as a technological evolution. It felt like betrayal. Inside the plants, tensions rose. Workers began voicing concerns to union reps. The mood shifted from anxious to angry. It wasn't just about job losses, it was about dignity. Workers weren't just losing hours. They were losing their identity. The rhythm of the engine line, the grind, the clang, the roar, was being replaced by sterile silence. The United Auto Workers, one of the most powerful labor unions in the country, began issuing warnings. If Stellantis continued down this path, eliminating combustion, offshoring battery parts, eliminating performance divisions, there would be consequences. Publicly, the union called for preservation of legacy jobs. Privately, the threat was clear: resume V8 production, or face an organized uprising. It wasn't an empty threat. Workers began staging walkouts, Internal communications leaked, revealing widespread resentment. The new electric vehicle jobs Stellantis promised, many of them paid less. They required different training, and in some cases, they were non-union. Stellantis leadership was stunned. They had anticipated some backlash, but not full-on rebellion. They expected wage negotiations. Instead, they got engine demands. The most radical part? Workers weren't just protesting the end of internal combustion. They were demanding its return. This wasn't the end. Instead, it marked the beginning of an even bigger backlash. The day the factory lines stopped, labor's demand for muscle. This wasn't a labor dispute. It was a battle for America's automotive soul. It began with murmurs in the Warren plant, then spread to Sterling Heights, then to Belvedere. In what became an unprecedented moment in automotive history, workers across multiple Stellantis facilities downed their tools, not in protest of pay, not in protest of hours, but in protest of electrification itself. The union's message was simple: bring back muscle or we walk. For years, the automotive narrative had been controlled by executives and environmental policymakers. But now the workers, the very people who built the cars, had seized the mic. Their argument wasn't abstract. It was raw. Jobs were vanishing. Culture was dissolving. The roar of the V8 was being replaced by algorithmically tuned silence. Internal documents leaked from Stellantis' labor relations office showed just how unprepared leadership was. Engineers tasked with training workers on battery assembly found themselves facing hostility. Performance shop teams, once the crown jewel of Dodge's development division, were being gutted. Morale plummeted. Factory leads described an identity crisis sweeping through their ranks. And this wasn't just a Stellantis issue. Ford and General Motors workers were watching. Union reps began using Stellantis as a test case. If labor could force a combustion comeback in one company, it could happen elsewhere. The media tried to frame it as resistance to modernization. But for those on the factory floor, it was a fight for survival. Politicians took notice. Governors in industrial states began voicing concern about the speed of electrification. Some aligned with labor, others played both sides, but the pressure was undeniable. Stellantis had not only triggered a labor revolt, it had reignited a national conversation about the future of work, identity, and the American auto industry. The day the factory lines stopped wasn't about cars. It was about the people who made them and the ripple effects it creates that will affect everyone. Now, the entire world was watching. European meltdown. Stellantis electric vehicle plans collapse in Brussels. Stellantis American gamble triggered chaos overseas. When Stellantis made its historic pivot back to internal combustion engines, it wasn't just Detroit that felt the impact. It was Brussels, Paris, and Berlin. In Europe, where government mandates and environmental policies had aggressively pushed for zero-emission vehicles by 2035, Stellantis' reversal was nothing short of heresy, and the backlash came fast. Within weeks of Stellantis' announcement that it would resume production of its iconic Hemi V8 engines, European regulators began issuing public statements condemning the move. Members of the European Parliament accused Stellantis of undermining the continent's environmental goals. France's Minister of Ecological Transition called it a step backward for global climate progress. In Italy, where Stellantis' Fiat brand still carried political weight, government officials expressed concerns about the economic fallout if European factories were deprioritized in favor of American muscle. The real damage, however, came from the financial markets. Stellantis' European stock listing took an immediate hit. Investors in France and Italy, who had bet heavily on Stellantis' electric vehicle roadmap, watched in horror as projections were slashed. Stellantis' electric vehicle plants in France and Germany faced production delays and budget cuts. The company's decision to double down on combustion engines in North America meant less capital investment in European electrification projects. Workers in Italy's Turin factory protested Stellantis' shift in strategy, fearing their jobs would evaporate as North American plants resumed combustion engine production. French unions threatened strikes of their own, arguing that Stellantis' American-first approach left European employees behind. But the real collision came at the policy level. European regulators, locked into emissions mandates and carbon targets, found themselves at odds with one of their largest automakers. Stellantis' global leadership was now caught in a political tug-of-war. praised in the United States for reviving combustion engines, condemned in Europe for betraying the green agenda. The fallout spread beyond Stellantis' own walls. Rival European automakers such as Volkswagen and Peugeot, who had committed fully to electric vehicle development, began facing questions from shareholders. If Stellantis was walking back electrification, how long before others followed? The impact was so severe that some European officials began lobbying for even stricter emissions targets to counteract Stellantis' rebellious stance. The European Union even pushed forward with discussions on potential trade barriers aimed at manufacturers who might undermine Europe's zero-emission future. But the shockwaves didn't stop in Europe. Asia reacts. How Toyota, Hyundai, and China change course. One move in Detroit made Tokyo and Beijing rethink everything. The moment Stellantis announced its return to combustion engines, the ripple effect reached boardrooms across Asia. In Tokyo, Toyota's leadership called an emergency meeting. For years, Toyota had resisted the full-scale electric vehicle push, preferring to invest in hybrid technology. They were mocked for it, criticized by environmental groups, analysts, and even rival automakers for not going all in on battery-powered vehicles. But now, Stellantis' reversal validated everything Toyota had quietly believed. Within weeks, Toyota doubled down on its hybrid strategy, increasing production targets and accelerating the rollout of next-generation hybrid drivetrains. Their messaging was blunt. Customers want choice, not mandates. The gamble paid off. Sales of Toyota hybrids surged in Japan, the United States, and Southeast Asia. In Seoul, Hyundai faced a different dilemma. They had committed billions to launching an electric pickup truck, betting it would rival the Ford Lightning and Ram 1500 REV. But Stellantis' decision to delay its own electric truck and bring back the Hemi shook Hyundai's confidence. Their market research teams reported increased skepticism among American consumers about battery-powered trucks. Hyundai quietly postponed its electric truck program by 2 years, shifting focus back to traditional internal combustion and hybrid models. And then there was China. The world's largest auto market had positioned itself as the electric vehicle superpower, exporting millions of battery-powered vehicles to Europe and beyond. But Stellantis' move, combined with shifting consumer demand in the United States, prompted Chinese automakers to reconsider their strategy. Companies like BYD and Geely began diversifying their product lines, adding more hybrid and combustion options to avoid being overexposed to a market that suddenly wasn't as committed to electrification as it seemed. China's government began recalibrating its energy policies to account for the growing demand for hybrid vehicles, realizing the strict transition to electric vehicles might leave some of their domestic brands vulnerable to market fluctuations. BYD, for example, shifted some of its resources back to conventional internal combustion engine development, citing Stellantis' bold move as a wake-up call that the automotive world was still balancing between two powerful forces: electrification and combustion. Asia wasn't abandoning electric vehicles, but Stellantis' rebellion forced them to acknowledge a simple truth. The market was changing. Consumer appetite for internal combustion hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had been reignited. The most unexpected reaction, however, was unfolding right here at home. Dealer rebellion. The front line of the automotive war. The boardrooms made the plans, but the dealers paid the price. Long before corporate executives and policymakers debated the future of transportation, one group felt the immediate impact of Stellantis' electric vehicle blunders: the dealers. For years, Stellantis had forced its dealer network to accept electric vehicle allocations, regardless of customer demand. Inventory piled up. Chargers and electric Rams sat unsold on lots from Michigan to Texas. Salespeople struggled to move vehicles customers didn't want. Incentives ballooned, lease deals were slashed. Some dealers resorted to offering deep discounts just to clear space for models they knew wouldn't sell. When Stellantis announced its combustion comeback, it wasn't just customers who celebrated, it was the dealerships. Across small towns and suburban communities, Stellantis dealers pushed back against the electric vehicle mandates they had been shackled to. Dealership associations in states like Ohio and Indiana issued statements applauding the company's decision to restore internal combustion production. Behind the scenes, the rebellion had been brewing for years. Dealers reported being penalized by Stellantis corporate for refusing to take electric vehicle inventory. Some were required to spend tens of thousands of dollars upgrading their facilities with charging infrastructure they never used. Salespeople felt abandoned, forced to pitch silent, soulless electric cars to customers who walked in asking for Hemis and Hellcats. When Stellantis shifted gears, the relief was palpable. Dealerships immediately reported a surge in foot traffic. Customers who had stayed away from showrooms returned. Used Hemi-powered vehicles disappeared off lots overnight. Demand for pre-owned Ram trucks and Dodge Challengers skyrocketed. The dealers understood something the corporate executives had ignored for too long. People didn't want mandates. They wanted choice. And in this moment, Stellantis had made the right call. In response, several dealerships began pushing Stellantis' strategy on social media, encouraging potential buyers to embrace the roar. One Michigan dealership posted a viral video showcasing the return of the Hemi V8 with the tagline, "The heart of America's automotive spirit, reborn." And when customers started voting with their wallets, that's when Ford and Chevrolet knew they had lost. The consumer revolt. How Stellantis won the war by giving people what they wanted. This wasn't just a business win, it was a cultural victory. The moment Stellantis revealed that it would bring back the Hemi V8, the American public responded in a way no market analyst could have predicted. It wasn't just a sales bump, it was an uprising. Across the United States, consumers flocked to Stellantis showrooms. Pre-orders for upcoming Hemi-powered Ram trucks and Dodge muscle cars broke company records. Social media lit up with celebratory videos of old-school gearheads, young enthusiasts, and even former critics cheering the return of American muscle. But the numbers told an even bigger story. Within 6 months of the announcement, Stellantis' market share in North America surged by more than 5%, almost entirely at the expense of Ford and General Motors. Demand for electric vehicles, which had already begun to plateau, took a sharp dive. Dealers couldn't keep used Hemi models on the lot. Auction prices for pre-owned Dodge Challengers and Ram TRXs shot up overnight. The cultural shift was undeniable. Stellantis hadn't just brought back an engine, they had brought back a feeling. American consumers, after years of being told they had no choice, finally felt like someone was listening. The combustion engine wasn't just mechanical, it was political, personal, and emotional. And the implications went far beyond sales. Labor unions celebrated the decision, seeing it as validation of their demands to protect factory jobs. Small-town economies that depended on internal combustion production, plants breathed a sigh of relief. Even lawmakers who had once championed aggressive electric vehicle mandates began softening their language. Some even began calling for a more gradual transition to electric vehicles, taking into account labor concerns. Ford and General Motors couldn't ignore the numbers. They began quietly revisiting their product strategies, reevaluating electric vehicle production targets, and facing mounting pressure from dealers and shareholders to offer more internal combustion options. Stellantis didn't just save itself, it flipped the entire automotive narrative. But what's your take on all of this? I know it's a lot, right? So let's talk down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I will see you there.